provider hosted app. Provider hosted apps for SharePoint include components that are deployed and hosted outside of the SharePoint farm. See, when we were developing SharePoint hosted app, everything was within the SharePoint farm. So we had a host web, we had an app web, and it was in the app web the app was deployed. App web resources is what app was able to use. App host web resources also app was able to use provided permissions were given. Now in provider hosted app, we are going to have an external website, a website which probably is deployed on some other machine altogether independently on internet, and in that website we will have the app hosted. App when deployed in a SharePoint site can use the resources from that provider hosted website. So basically we are now talking about developing and hosting an app in an environment which itself may or may not be a .NET application or a .NET site. I can have a PHP website hosting a SharePoint app. I can have a ASP.NET MVC website. I can have a Java JSP website which is hosting the app, and the app is deployed into the Microsoft SharePoint site. So how are we going to do this? So for this, I start Visual Studio. Let's say I run it as administrator. But now this time for development I would like to use, click on OK. Let us say simple provider hosted app. One. So I am developing a simple provider hosted app, and for this debugging I am using a SharePoint Office 365 site, the developer site which we have earlier created in Office 365, and here I change it to now provider hosted. Click on next. We have two ways of authenticating. The app can authenticate to the provider hosted site either using client secret, or we can also have a complete certificate generated. This is a separate procedure. We'll have to generate a certificate and then use that certificate. Of course, self-signed certificate also can be used. We are not getting into this part. We will go with, let's say, client secret and a certificate. Say finish. This is going to generate some skeleton code, and we are going to review that now. So now we have here two projects. One is the simple provider hosted app 1, which is actually the SharePoint app project, and there is another project, simple provider hosted app 1 web. This is basically a web application. Of course, this is an ASP.NET web application which may be within my SharePoint farm, which can be completely outside the SharePoint farm on a different machine altogether. So this app is going to become available to a SharePoint site in which it is going to be deployed through this web application. So this web application can provide all the required resources to this app when it executes in a SharePoint site, when it is deployed included in a SharePoint site. So let us try to study what all things we have here. First, of course, web.config is there. In web.config, I would like to show you there is app setting for key which has client ID and client secret. This have to be fixed. Once the app is hosted, these two values we will fix it. Right now it is not there. We are going to get that generated when we do debugging. And then there is token helper.cs. This is basically a helper class which is going to validate the app as a valid client for the resources in this particular hosted application. I will explain that whole thing in a short while. Now I have default.aspx. Default.aspx is an ordinary ASPX file, nothing special about it. In this, in case we want, we can put all the GUI elements, and these GUI elements we can program it in the corresponding default.aspx.cs. In default.aspx.cs, what is important is the code which is there in page load. So here the following code gets the client context and title property using token helper. See, basically the whole story begins with we need a context. And once we have the context, we can get the data from the host web as well as from the app. Right now there is no app web. Remember, in this particular example, there is no app web. If it is app web, it is always going to be a subsite of the host web. And we do not have an app web, though we, in case needed, can have an app web. Let us not get into those details of app web now. First, I will do nothing. I would simply press Ctrl F5 and execute this. So in browser, it will try to open, but for that, first it will ask me for my Office 365 account details, and I have to provide one. Connect to Sharepoint, Office 365. So I have already got my account. I'll use the same. Keep me signed in Studio. So we are providing these details to Studio, and Studio will ensure that thereafter it automatically connects to Office 365 so that we can do debugging in that particular SharePoint site. See, web.config updated with client ID. This is very important. Now the web.config of the web application, which is right now hosted on my local machine only, is updated with this particular client ID. And we can obviously see that in, see, web.config is updated. And whatever was the ID there, that we can see here now. So this client ID is going to play a very major role in SharePoint in provider hosted app. As usual, say trust it. It will take us to a URL from where the output will be rendered in the SharePoint. It's a full page app. Basically we have here, it's a full screen app. What we have right now developed is a full screen app. This is the one, dev site, which is actually the URL title of the main site. Now what is important is to review this URL. So let me open this in Notepad. And to be noted, this URL is a local website. This website is not inside SharePoint. This is outside the SharePoint farm. Right now I have it on my machine running in a IIS web server. See here, this is IIS Express Edition, which is hosting that site. Of course, this can become a site on internet. Also to be noted, we have SP host URL, but we do not have SP app URL. We have host URL only here, which is the URL of my development site. Then we have SP language, SP client tag, and product number, but we do not have app URL. So there is right now app web not available. App web is not there right now. But in case we want to have an app web, we can simply do that by adding something to this app, and that something can be a simple module which we may not even use it. Right now there is nothing in this, that is why app web was not created. Now I have just added an module here, though I may not do anything with that module. This will ensure that we now have an app web also. So we have three sites now. The app web, which is where we can have certain things related to SharePoint. We can have a provider hosted site, which can also be used by, so basically now app is going to be installed in a SharePoint site, but it can make use of resources from app web as well as the host web, two places. And now once it gets redirected to the full page, I copy this once again. This time we'll see that we have app web also, SP app web URL. Earlier we did not have this. Now we have SP app web URL. Now what is this URL? We have this as HTTPS, followed by that this is colon, and then we have got DSS 001, and then you see some hash code. So this is very similar to now doing a combination of SharePoint hosted and provider hosted. We are doing a combination, though this app web URL is absolutely not needed if in an app we do not want to use the SharePoint components, like I don't want a list, I don't want any kind of event receiver, I don't want those kind of things in my app. Then in such case we don't need app web URL. Host is more than sufficient, along with of course the provider website. So I stopped the debugging session. Now let us get into the programming stuff. So we have pages default.aspx, which further has default.aspx.cs. Let us try to understand the code in this page load now. First and most important, there is a token helper class which is getting me the context from the request. Let's select this method and press F12. Now what is this method doing? This method is checking in the request, is there a parameter by this name or this name or this name or this name. In the request, if any of these parameter exists, either in the form of the posted value request.form or in the form of query string, then based on that the value is returned. That basically from the request it is extracting a token. The token can come in any of these parameter names. So once the token is received, we go back here. That token is what is here, and of course this token has to come from the app. So what is going to happen? I repeat, SharePoint site is going to have an app deployed, and from a SharePoint site, right now let us say the debugging website what we have, developer website, from that site a request will be initiated for a page in this particular site, and along with that request we are going to have one of these tokens submitted along with the value of course, and that value is being returned as a token, context token. Now this context token has to be validated with what? With the host URL. The context token has to be validated. So host web URL we are giving here, the context token also we are giving here, and of course the request URL domain name, host name or IP address from where the app has submitted the request, that is also given here. So now this method, again press F12, and you see now we have got get client context with context token is calling read and validate context token. Now what is this read and validate context token going to do? Validate the specified context token string for the application based on the parameter specified in web.config. So basically whatever token is submitted, that is going to be validated against the values which are given here. So this method will get me context token by validating the token submitted against the value which is given over here. And once we have that, with that context token a context is created and returned. Basically a client context is what we get here. Of course all this code is skeleton already generated, we do not have to play around with it, but just to know that this token helper is the one which will get us the context, and once we get the context we know what to do. We can load the web. Of course this is C# code now. Whatever we have learned in client side object model, that code we are now writing. So client context.web, we are just loading the title property by executing the query, and that title we are writing it to the browser. No doubt in default.aspx we can have whatever control we want, and these controls can get data by writing the code here. Right now I'm getting title. Let us say I want to get all the lists. How do we get all the lists? So what is that we need to do now to get along with title lists also? So yes, we know that here itself we can say web implies web.lists. So even list property will initialize when we do this. Followed by this, from this list I am going to construct a list of string which has, let's say, list of names of all the list. Now use for each list in client context dot web dot list. So one list at a time we are getting, and this we will add it to the names collection. Now it's the time to display this list. We'll add title rather, to be precise. Now where do we display this list? Somewhere we have to display this list. For this, let's go to default.aspx, and in default.aspx from toolbox, drag and drop a control with GUI. Let us say grid view. We can say grid view of lists. And here I go back and say grid view dot data source is equal to list of, names of list, and of course grid view dot data bind. So what are we doing here? The provider hosted site is executing client side script, which for provider hosted is server side script. On the provider side it is a server side, but in general this is a client side object model which is querying data from the Sharepoint site, and with that it is making a page and rendering it to the browser. Now press Ctrl F5. It should give me the list of all lists which are present in my Sharepoint developer site. Now same thing we can as well display it as a web part. How? Let us say now here I am adding a web part. Add a new item, that is a web part, client web part. Say lists web part. Click on add. Create a new web part page, or do you want to have an existing page used? Something similar we got even in Sharepoint hosted. So we want to create a new web part page. So now you will see that we will have in two places. One, within the Sharepoint app we have got elements.xml. Elements.xml is referring to a source which is list web part in the provider hosted site. This is the provider site which has list web part, and in this we have again the opportunity of placing a grid view of lists, and in the corresponding CS file I will copy all that code which I have in default.aspx, including the context token and everything stuff here. Just copy as it is and paste it here. And of course, in case we want to pass data, we can always add it as a query string parameter. In elements.xml, we can add a property here. I have already taught you this in the previous chapter, and that query string can be included here in this particular format. So grid view with GUI and the corresponding code to initialize that grid view in the corresponding CS file. And now we want to include this web part in the Sharepoint site, but first let us run this. On execution of this, now we have all this extra. Deploying app for Sharepoint. Uninstall the app. The client ID is updated. Now it is installing again. Trust it. This is fine, but we are not interested in this. What are we interested in? We are interested in going to developer site, which is this one. And in developer site, we want to add that web part, list web part. So in developer site, we can edit the page, insert app part, and here we should have list web part. add it. Save it. We might probably increase the height. So we have the list. Of course, right now we have to scroll by selecting and seeing, because we have restricted the width and height here. That is in elements.xml. We have here default width, default height, which can be further increased, or you can probably provide a more better div tag with scrollable facilities and all that. That's of course design aspect which you have to take care of. But what we have to note here is, between provider hosted app and SharePoint hosted app, what is the difference? In provider hosted app, we are writing code on server. Of course, it is a client side object model, but in the provider hosted app, we are writing code which executes on the server. Whereas in SharePoint hosted app, it was all JavaScript. Here we do not have JavaScript, though we can have JavaScript here also. We can always have app.js concept over here, and probably on another example I'll demonstrate that. But yes, in routine, this is the better way of doing it. In default.aspx, we can have our design, and of course this default.aspx itself can be a PHP file, and this PHP project is rendering some output which the app is showing it in the SharePoint site. And we have also seen we can have a web part added to the SharePoint app, and that web part further requests a file on a provider hosted site along with the standard tokens. And this, after validating, we are able to validate here. After validating the token, we are able to get the output. Now there is a big issue here. Let's go back to default.aspx, and I'll put here simply one button called as refresh, so that it makes a trip to server. So this is button refresh, and when the button refresh is clicked, automatically it will go to server and execute the code of the CS file. Execute the code of default.aspx.cs file in the page load itself. So we don't even need to write code in button click. But let us see the problem. I press Ctrl F5. First, it will take me to the SharePoint site. SharePoint site, developer site, is now submitting the request for the app full page output, and along with that request, it will submit lot of tokens, and then we get it here. But now if I click on refresh, we'll get an exception. Why? There is a security token not included now. So what we will do is, ideally speaking, in page load we are getting this token. This token we can either store it in session. We can have ASP.NET HTTP session which can store this and retrieve it later, or we can add it in cookie and retrieve it later. So let me show you, if I want to do it through cookie, how to do it. So token, I'll simply declare it here. It's a string variable, and then I will check if request.cookies of, let's say, context token, the key I'm giving is CT, if is equal to null, that means that cookie is not there. In such case, I'll initialize context token with the value generated from here. But else I'll say I want to generate the context token. Context token, this time I'll take it from the cookie. I'll copy this dot value, and of course in this case I will add it to the cookie. That's very important. Once we have the context token retrieved or generated, we have to add it. So cookies of context token dot value is equal to the context token. So if the cookie is not there, we are taking it from the helper, but if the cookie is there, we are taking it from the cookie. And of course, when we take from the helper, we add it to the cookie. So this way what will happen, when I click on button and make a round trip, that time cookie will be there and that cookie will provide the context token rather than the input parameters. See, this method was doing what? This particular method was getting the parameter for token from these input parameters, which can be submitted by the SharePoint app either in the form of posted data or in query string. But now that is not there. Now the request is not coming from a SharePoint developer site. It is coming back to the same page from the same website. So in such case, I am using cookie. Now let us run this. So SharePoint site is submitting the request to the local host, the provider site. The provider site fetched the data from the SharePoint site, made a page and rendered it. Now refresh, we will not get the exception. Every time it goes back, because from the cookie it is there, it is working now. Of course, the cookie I have not given any expiration date. So it should be expired after some time. That is, when the browser is closed, automatically the cookie will expire and next time a new token will work. So for debugging this, you have to ensure that every time you open a new browser instance, do not use the existing browser instance. That you have to take care of. So yes, this is how we develop a SharePoint hosted app.